Welcome to the Couples Expert Podcast with Stuart Fensterheim, LCSW, your source for the latest tips and practical down-to-earth advice on creating emotionally connected, thriving relationships. Now, here's Stuart.
Welcome to the Couples Expert Podcast, and welcome to episode 81. This is Stuart Fensterheim. Yes, I said episode 81. I am so thrilled to be able to announce that we now have done 80 episodes of this podcast. What's exciting about it is not only that we've done so many, and that I'm hopeful that all of you listeners and all of you in my community really feel that this podcast speaks to you and speaks to you about the topics that are really meaningful to help you have that incredible relationship with your spouse, your partner, even with your children and family. Because what we know is that this podcast talks about the steps that are necessary to really have a truly connected relationship, one in which you can be genuine, authentic, and be yourself, and knowing that your partner sees all of you and loves all of you incredibly. This week's podcast in particular will be on something a little bit different. As you know, I'm doing the 3 podcast series on relationships and its stages. Last week we did the early stages. Today, what we're going to be talking about, and I have a guest on my show to talk about raising, yes, folks, raising those horrible, terrible adolescent kids, those that want to think for themselves, speak for themselves, and not always listen to our rules. So what we're going to talk about is how do you have that challenge in your relationship and still keep the two of you being close, being connected, and not letting the kids get in the way of the two of you seeing each other as truly having each other's back. So what we want to do with these adolescent kids is we want to really raise them to a place where we can send them out in the world to school, to work, and know that we could relax and know that they would behave in ways that we would be proud of and be able to really be at peace, that we've taught them the way that we need to, and that the two of them feel, that the children feel loved, feel important, feel cared about, and that their life is beginning in terms of a happy time, a happiness where they are really searching for their own path in this world, which includes careers and families. And what we hope is that what we've taught them is the value of connection, on love, and that it's not a pie-in-the-sky dream, but it's something very real and obtainable, and that your relationship, the model that you have in your home, is one in which you would be really proud of them having a relationship just like yours. And what we know is that that's not always the case. What I'd like to do is introduce our guest. My guest is Dr. Robert Pate. He's a psychologist, a counselor from Huntington Beach. Dr. Pate is a licensed psychologist working in private practice in Orange County, California. Orange County, for those that don't know, is where Disneyland is. And if you have adolescent kids and you've lived out there, what you know is that you can probably go almost any weekend to Disneyland, to Knoxbury Farm, and really know that you'll stand in line for a very long time, because that's a lot where the kids hang out. And in Dr. Pate, what he has done is he really has focused his practice on dealing with those of us of the male gender, the male species. And for a lot of women, we're sort of this unknown entity. And what he's going to do for the women out there, he's going to really help all of you understand your men better. And how he's going to do that is in terms of talking about the relationship that the two of you need to establish. and how to really be present for one another. And his primary focus is, and what I'm really interested in hearing Dr. Pate talk about, is to talk about how do we deal with our lives as couples with adolescents in the home. I'd like to, before I move on and introduce him, I want to thank Ernesto, who is a videographer that I've used, and some of you may have seen my website. The video that's on the homepage is the one that he did for me. And Ernesto and Dr. Pate actually work in the same practice. And I want to thank Ernesto for turning me on to Dr. Pate, because what I've learned about Dr. Pate is he really is someone that gives back to the community. He's been on a number of podcasts before, so I'm excited to sort of introduce you to him through my podcast. So, Dr. Pate, welcome to the Couples Expert Podcast.
Stuart, hi. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's really exciting to have two guys on. You know, I don't do it that much because, at least in our field, I think the number of men doing what we do is not as much as some other occupations. So it's really cool to have you on.
Yeah. I was at a training this weekend around couples therapy, and of the participants, I was the only male out of 15 participants. So that's been my experience as well, which really leads me to my first question, because I'm always fascinated about why people go into our profession. And not everyone, some people have life experiences. Some people just do it because they're interested in it. Tell my listeners a bit about why you chose to be a counselor and a little bit about why you chose the specialty you did. Yeah, absolutely. So kind of dates back to undergrad, actually. So my undergraduate work, I was the president of a club, and one of the things that I found is that just people gravitated toward me and wanted to share their stories and some of their struggles. And I just really enjoyed that. I enjoyed hearing their stories, and I didn't always give out a lot of advice. And that sometimes rings true for me today in practice. I like to help people find their own answers, because my answer to something is not always going to be the thing that fits your life. But I like to help people find their own answers. And so that was something that back in my undergraduate career, I just really found that I enjoyed hearing other people's stories. And I had a really great mentor, the head of our psychology department and the honors program, and he encouraged me to pursue clinical psychology. And so I checked that out and went ahead and pursued a doctorate in clinical psychology. And during that training, one of the things that I found is that I really enjoyed having more than one person in the room with me. And the reason being that you get the full story there. You get the full picture. So one of the things that I found in my graduate training was that if I just had one person in the room, that I was only getting one part of the story. And a lot of times people that come in for individual counseling would still be talking about their relational concerns. And so what I noticed with couples is that you get both people in the room and the picture gets more clear, and you get both sides of the story and you see the problem unfold right in front of you. And so I just love that, because I find that I can work with the problem directly, and people can find healing more quickly than if they come in on their own in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I have this similar experience. I mean, you and I do similar things because we're both couples counselors. I think we work a little differently. But one of the power of the couple is a very interesting phenomenon. And I've been using this over and over again in the work I do with couples and my weekend retreats, which is Kelly Clarkson's song, Piece by Piece. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. Are you?
No. Tell me about it.
It's a fascinating song because, you know, she was the first American Idol. And basically, she came on the show recently just to sort of do this sort of reunion thing. And she sang this song, and it blew everybody away. And it's emotionally focused therapy, which is my model, to the T. Basically, what it's about the song is about that she had a father that abandoned her as a child. And her experience with men and I was talking in my introduction about you and your work with men in particular. Her experience with men were that men abandoned their families. But then she met her current husband. And due to the work that they've done in their relationship, she now has a perspective of men and of her father that has that trauma be less important because her present life with her husband, she has a man that has her back. She has a man that cares about her. So now she believes men don't always leave. That would never have occurred individually.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, you're speaking to one of the things that I love about couples work is that a lot of times our partner can help us to heal from those old wounds. A lot of that unfinished business, they can help us finish that business together when we learn to have a healthy relationship that maybe we'd never had before.
Right. And if you can learn to be authentic. And that's really where I go, which is the authenticity. If you could be authentic with your partner and know they love you in spite of everything that you are, meaning not in spite of, but because they see all of you and they love all of you, even some of the things that aren't so positive, you could relax.
Oh, yeah. I'm trying to remember who the quote's from, but just recently I heard a quote about, why is a committed relationship so important? And it's because we have somebody that's a witness to our lives. And it's not that they love every little thing about us as much as we might say that in romantic songs and things. There are always going to be some little things that we're different about or that bother us about our partner. But I just love that in a committed relationship, we have someone who witnesses all of us, the day-to-day, our celebrations and our failures, and they're there with us through it all. And I just love the beauty of that. And I'm totally with you on that.
And I think in terms of the topic that we want to talk about today, there's nothing that flares couples up more than when they have a difficult child or a child that has some significant problems, whether they're emotional or school or other ways. The adolescent age of a child is a somewhat unique developmental stage. Mm-hmm. And that is the area that you work a lot in. So I'm curious how you work with these couples who really may have different opposing opinions on how to deal with these issues.
Yeah, and sometimes, especially in my work with individual men, and for some reason I seem to have a lot of men in various aspects of the medical field coming in. A lot of them are divorced and are dating now and have teenage children, and they're on their second or third marriage by now, and they're wanting to figure out, how can I do this blended family thing? And I mean that, that's always going to be difficult, but you mix in a changing teenage brain and risky behavior and they're getting into new relationships, and it can just be pretty chaotic in the home there. So, I think there are lots of ways to look at it, and you can look at it from the blended family perspective. Is this a new family that's trying to form, or is this an established family that is now just dealing with this new stage of the children? And obviously you're going to have to take a slightly different tack depending on what your couple's situation is or your family situation. But I certainly think that they can find some kind of peace, to steal Kelly Clarkson's word, to find some peace in the chaos there. And certainly a lot of that has to do with the relational foundation of the couple and what have they been building during those earlier years of the child's life.
So how do you see that piece of what they've been building, or how close they are or distant they are, and how does that piece of the child's issues play itself out with the couple?
Well, I mean, even if we just take a healthy teenage child who doesn't have any kind of mental illness or any kind of serious behavior concerns, even just your typical teenager, especially before they're able to drive themselves around, is going to in some ways wreak havoc in your family because there are just so many demands on a family's time. If I were just to speak from my own experience, I was in 5 different sports, 2 choirs, and Model United Nations when I was in high school. And, I and my siblings created a taxi driver situation for our parents before we were able to drive ourselves. And that happens for a lot of families with teenagers. They become taxi drivers and they don't see each other very often. So in terms of the foundation, I think there are some core strategies that these couples, these parents can use to make sure that even if that is their situation, that they can still make the most of their relationship and put their relationship first.
What would be some of those strategies? Because I know that driving piece as well. And I had two girls, and they were both pretty active. One was in gymnastics, the other did other things. And the conflicts that can get created of who's going to do the drive and who picks up who and who's going to drop off and who deals with school, all of those things. What are some of the strategies that you could share with my audience that might help them not have it be such a problem area for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things is just general organization around the family. So in that regard, sitting down at the beginning of each week or the end of each week and planning out the next week that's to come, just looking at what is on the calendar so that each day doesn't begin with chaos and trying to figure out on the fly, okay, I thought you were going to go here. Are you taking him or her to soccer practice? Are you picking her up from ballet? So that you've got a plan in mind. And that's not just hashing out who's going to be the taxi driver for which kid at which time, but also organizing the rest of the schedule and maybe even planning out things like what meals are we going to have, and maybe prioritizing certain days or evenings that the family gets together so that even amidst all of the busyness and the chaos that there's still some together time. And sometimes that doesn't happen. But it's more likely to happen if we've planned it out in advance. So I think a first strategy is just getting together, putting your heads together, getting your calendars out, maybe even syncing calendars now. We've got our smartphones. We can do that now. And for a lot of calendar applications, we can sync calendars. So that's one basic thing to do that has really nothing to do with the kids' behavior, but just to say, as a family, can we be on the same page about things? And that's just scheduling.
And I think some of it is also about, do you make the time and set the time aside, not for the kids' activities, but for the two of you? Because what we know is that if the two of you feel a strong bond, negotiating those things become so much easier. But when you have some doubts already, and now we have whose schedule gets impacted. And now we're talking about, I have to protect my own turf. Mm-hmm. That can blow couples out of the water.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one core strategy that people can use, I think, to benefit their relationship and their family ultimately is to think maybe not how can I protect my turf, as you said there, but what's something I can take off of my partner's plate? I know they're busy. I know I'm busy, but how can I be there for them and kind of be the first person to give as opposed to waiting to get something before we volunteer something back?
Right. And if you define your partner as using you, which is what I hear quite often, mm-hmm. your willingness to take something off your partner's plate goes way down the tubes. So what I like to talk about is all of these things that we're addressing today really are helped when the couple is strong. It's not really about strategizing for this or that, although that's necessary. But if you just do that, you'll never get there, because unless you have a real sense that your partner is there for you, you'll never give.
Absolutely. Yeah. If that attachment relationship isn't there, there's just going to be no willingness to put yourself out there and be vulnerable and say, yeah, let me take this off your plate, because you may feel they're going to take advantage of me and I won't get anything back. I won't get my needs met. What
about the issue of things like substances? Because I think it's such a big topic now. Things like alcohol and drugs, meth, some of the legal substances. In working with the couple, how do you help couples sort of really go through that sort of terrible time And what is some of the supportive things that you have found helpful to help couples really get a better perspective of what's going on?
Yeah, and I think really that gets back to one of the key words you mentioned earlier, and that's modeling. And I think, kids are going to make their own decisions, and that's going to happen no matter what gets modeled for them. But I think we can kind of guide them in the right direction and a healthier direction, and hopefully have some influence over their ultimate decisions. But a lot of times what the parents are modeling can end up helping them in the long run. So, are they modeling, oh man, I've had a hard day, I need a glass of wine, as opposed to just having the glass of wine and not connecting it to a stressor and coping and it being a normative thing. So what's being modeled around substance use? But even if they've been great models and their kid, their almost adult starts to use substances, I think that's where the open communication can be really helpful, and having established a safe setting to talk about things. And I think this is where a lot of parents get into trouble here, is that they may start to shame their child, blame their child, and tell them they're bad, tell them they make bad choices, and they forget that this is a person they're talking to and this is their child. And if they go on attack mode, what's going to happen? When we get attacked, we withdraw. We see that with couples all the time. So we're certainly going to see that with our children as well. So if we go into attack mode when we see a problem behavior that we don't like or that seems dangerous, instead of coming in with more of a holding attitude, a holding mindset and safety, we're going to shut down that communication before we even get a chance to say what we want to say. And I would say with that, one thing that can be helpful is similar to what we would do with couples, again, is going with a listen first mindset and say, hey, I found this weed in your backpack. What's going on with that? Can you tell me about it? Instead of going into attack mode, you're in trouble, you're grounded for life, saying, hey, have you been feeling stressed? What have you been using this for? And that way you get a bit of the story. And if you can get some of the story out, you might have a more compassionate way to help them to curb that issue, as opposed to just attacking, making them go on the defense, and then just not wanting to talk at all with you and going back to those friends for support when they don't get support from you.
And I think what happens as parents, we tend to catastrophize all of this.
Yeah.
So we see someone experimenting and, for the first time smoking some marijuana, and we have them already shooting up in our heads. And I think we have to slow some of those things down and especially out here in Arizona now, because this November, when the election is, one of the ballots on this year's election voting is legalizing recreational marijuana. And it leads me to sort of this same whole topic, not so much taking a position, yes, it's okay, or no, it's not. But when we have such a very sticky situation already with substances, do you see that those types of lines that get grayed out make it harder for parents? Or do you think it sort of makes it easier because it's the whole legal thing is all not there?
Right. I mean, that does take one of the tools out of the tool belt for parents. But at the same time, if they're using some kind of substance, even one that's legal, if they're using it in a coping way, as opposed to just to do it because their friends are doing it because it's fun, if they're using it in a coping way, then all of the laws in the world aren't going to change something for them. I mean, why do people use other substances, cocaine and meth? Why do they use that? Oh, it's coping, and they've tried other things that didn't work to take away whatever stressor or pain they had. So I think, again, that creating a safe place for kids to learn other coping skills and to bring their problems to parents, I think that can be helpful for them in hopefully stopping that before it starts, or at least if it does start and they catch their child, discover it, or if it's just being used right out in front of them, that they can have an honest conversation about it without it being threatening to the child.
Right. And what I like to sort of think about with this exact topic is if your child is coping with something by using, I don't really care what it is, whether it's alcohol, whether it is a legal prescribed medication. I define substance abuse a little different than I think a lot of people do. And I use the coping as sort of my line, because I don't care what we call it. If you're using something to get by, to get through your day, and you need a substance, even if it was water, if you're drinking the glass of water to cope with your marriage, to cope with the argument with your kids, you're abusing it. Mm-hmm. And we don't have to care what we call it. So we want that. But here's the bigger issue I think that you and I address and deal with, is if your child is unable to come to you and say, I'm having a problem coping, I would hope each one of you, and as a couple, you begin to ask yourself, why couldn't they talk to me about it?
Yeah.
Why couldn't they tell me that someone was talking about using marijuana and now I'm trying to figure it out? Why aren't they bouncing that off of me, at least? Not that they're going to necessarily tell me if they're doing it, so I'm not that foolish, but at least bringing it up to me. What's missing in the connection? And that's really where the model of the couple and the model that what you offer couples, which incredibly is helping them have a different way of looking at it.
Yeah. And what I hear from a lot of couples and even individual clients is that they often say that I never saw that modeled for me. I never saw expressing myself as being okay. I never saw that conversation, that invitation to really share, this is where I'm at. They didn't have that modeled for them. And so that's not their model as parents now.
Right.
Their model that was modeled for them was punitive. And it was, here's the law of the land and you do it or you get punished, as opposed to here's what we value as a family. Here's what's important to us and what's healthy, what works. And if you're not doing that, let's have a conversation about it and see if we can help you to function well in life.
And it's not always say you're bad, don't do this, period, because I say so. And, there's all this talk about the changes in how we can discipline or not discipline. I think if you focus on discipline, you're losing the big picture, which is how do we come together as a family? Because the thing that so many people forget about is your relationship with your child, your relationship with each other is going to last a whole lot longer, hopefully, than just the time that they're there living with you. Mm-hmm. And you can't forget that we're talking about a lifetime.
Yeah. And, I've had plenty of clients who just don't talk to their family anymore because that just wasn't the case for them. They just, they never felt welcome, like they were part of something. And so they were just kind of there. They were kids in a family that, was chaotic or had a lot of anger. There was volatility and they just didn't want that in their lives anymore. So when they grew up and they moved out, they bailed. They just said,
right.
I don't want to be part of this. I'm jumping ship.
Right. So let's focus for the last few minutes that we have, because we only have about 5-10 minutes left for today. And I want to really bring in your expertise with men and how you see that component contributing to either the difficulty with a couple and how you use that, particularly in bringing the adolescent piece in it as well, as much as you can. But more importantly, what have you learned from working with men about the relationships and where it all falls apart?
I think that communication and vulnerability is often a big sticking point for a lot of guys. And, we're taught as men that we need to be kind of buttoned up and have our game face on at all times, that vulnerability is not always a great thing. We're taught to be tough and to not always share feelings. And especially when we start looking at kind of that greatest generation of men and one generation really on either side of that, where it was just more about, you got to keep a straight face and have a strong chin and tough it out when tough times come. And so, we're starting to see some changes in that with millennials and younger generations, that they're told a little bit more that it's okay to have feelings, but it's still, there's so much that we're fighting culturally around expectations for men. So one of the things that I tend to see a lot with couples is that the male in a relationship will often feel like if he's coming in there, if we're looking at a heterosexual relationship, a male and a female coming in, a lot of times the male that comes in will anticipate that he's going to be sided against. that the therapist, whether it's a male or female, but especially a female, they're worried that the woman is going to take the perspective of their spouse or their partner, their female partner, against them. And so it's going to be just a bashing session against them. And so one of the things that I try to talk about with my couples right away when they come in, regardless of what the issue is that I make it very clear to them that my client in the room is their relationship. It's not one of you, because I don't want to take sides. I want both of you to feel happy. And the way that's going to work is if we get your relationship to a healthy place. So I try to allay that fear right off the bat and just say, you know what, I'm not either one of you's person. I am here for your relationship, and I want both of you to be happy with that relationship and feel safe, comfortable, and like you're thriving in that relationship. And so that's an important one there. Also, feelings. I mean, we both got some history working with EFT here, as I believe, and that's such an important piece there. That attunement, being able to express feelings, feeling safe, and then that listening piece. So many times, a lot of the men want to either solve a problem or defend themselves when they're asked about something. Even if they're asked in a positive way, they want to defend their behavior before. So, they may get a little agitated, even just biologically. There's not a whole lot they can do. They may need to prevent that anyway. So when they feel agitated, we need to talk about how can we calm down so that you can listen in a non-defensive way, so that you can empathize with your partner before you share your own perspective on something. But a lot of times that affect is kind of a scary thing for guys because we just don't have as much practice growing up doing that. We're taught to be doers, not speakers and feelers.
And I think what's been fascinating for me in some of the couples workshops that I do, I've been doing a lot of looking for material. And one person that most people if they haven't heard of her, they know of her name because she's one of the top TED Talk folks, which is Brene Brown. And Brene Brown recently did this study, which really tells you the struggle for men, which was on vulnerability. And the thing that fascinated her with her latest, I don't know how long ago it was that when she looked at men, because she didn't really look at men in the beginning, she only did women. And one guy came up to her at a book signing once and said, well, what about men? She says, I don't really study that. And he looked her square in the eye and said, well, that's convenient. And then so she finally started to pull it apart. What she found, which fascinated her, which feels so right to me, and why we as men and women have such a hard time, is that the people who were the most critical of men being vulnerable were the ones asking them to be vulnerable, their partners. When men actually went to vulnerability, the women viewed it as weakness, didn't like it, but truthfully wants it. So what her conclusion basically is number one, we have a tough road ahead of us, men and women, in trying to make this work. But number two, if you can have a woman in your life and a man is sitting there looking fragile, talking about vulnerability, and could just be there. And if a woman is looking at a man and talking about her vulnerability, and us men don't try to fix anything, but just be there, we're going to be, you've talked about, those are men and women that have done tremendous work on themselves, and their marriage, their relationships will be pretty special.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
It's a fascinating study.
Yeah, and there's so, like you said, there's so much work there for a lot of people that has to be done before they can get to that place. And if one person is there and the other's not, I mean, that can be such a difficult thing for the relationship to have people at very different points of ability around empathy. So, certainly as couples therapists, that's something that we want to work on and find a little more equity in that skill level for our couples that we work with, for sure.
And we want to tell couples, both men and women, who are doing an incredible job of being willing to take some of these risks to really reach out to get the help that they might need because they see the importance that you have to be kind to yourself. It may not happen overnight, but make sure that you and your partner both look each other square in the eye and say, thank you for being the kind of person that makes us important.
Yeah, one of the things around that I like to do with my couples is I like to help them set their partner up for success. So they come in with big goals. He never listens to me. I want him to be a better listener. Or we haven't had sex in a year. How are we gonna get back together? They've got these goals, and I say, okay, well that's great, and that may be down the road here. It might be a few weeks, a few months, who knows? But what's a little piece of this that you feel reasonably confident that your partner can do for you right now, and they might actually do it. Ask for that, because if you can get in the mode of having things to praise your partner about, to value about them, to feel good about, then you're going to be heading down a much better road. You'll be in a much better mood when you're talking with them. You'll assume the positive a lot more, and you just might get them. If you're praising them enough, you might get them to be vulnerable like you're wanting them to be. So it's that idea of kind of lowering the bar, not in the long term, but just saying right now, what's something small that you can ask for so you can set your partner up for success?
I just want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing of yourself today and really giving some really nice examples as well as suggestions for the couples. And as I think about the things that you talked about today, what I'm hearing you talk about is really valuing each other and what you bring to the relationship, a willingness to really give of yourself and look your partner square in the eye and say, what could I do to help you? Because when you do that, that comes right back at you. And that the value here is really making sure that the two of them are important and that you have to talk about these things.
Absolutely.
So
trust and communication.
So thank you so very much for coming on. Before we end, though, I'd like to ask sort of one last question, if you would. And it's a question I like to ask of most of my guests because, when we are a therapist, you come into this with your own life experiences. And sometimes, at least for me, quite often what happens is I get surprised by myself. And I want to ask you sort of a similar question, which is in your work with couples and you work with men and you work with kids and you work with families, what surprised you about you in your work?
I think something that surprises me is that even in really tough conversations, that we can still together have a laugh. And I think that. A lot of people get scared by therapy and they think it's going to be this terrible, terrifying, awful experience. And what I find with a lot of couples is that we can find things to laugh about together. And, we don't lose sight of the big picture of there are things to work on here, but we can laugh with each other and kind of at each other at times. And that's just all part of that vulnerability and growing an attachment bond. And so I think one thing that I was surprised by as I've done more couples work is just the ability of people to still laugh with each other, even in difficult times, just to find levity.
Well, thank you again. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in again. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and the interview with Dr. Pate. And I just want to remind everyone about subscribing to the podcast. I would like that very much because I'm really on this mission to getting the word out of ways to really have those significant relationships by bringing on experts like Dr. Pate. And if you subscribe to the podcast, you'll get updates. The other thing that we do is I do my 3 Minutes with Stuart video every day. And you can look at that on my iTunes channel. And please like our Facebook page. And we'll see you all next time. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode with your host, Stuart Fensterheim. You're one step closer to reigniting that fiery passion with your partner. For more information
and your 30-minute free phone consultation with Stuart,
visit www.thecouplesexpertscottsdale.com. We'll see you next time.